Sam Morgan sat by the fire, his broad hands steady as he worked. The whittling knife scraped gently against the leather, each stroke slow and deliberate. The piece of pine in his lap had no shape yet, just a rough block waiting to be transformed. It had been years since Sam had cared to carve with any purpose. Before Abigail died, he'd made things for the cabin, things that mattered. He had even smiled while he worked. Those days felt so far away now, like a forgotten life. Now, the cabin was silent, except for the crackling fire and the occasional gust of wind outside. The storm had rolled in fast. Snow swirled outside the windows, thick and heavy, a reminder of the harsh winters that had taken so much from him. The fire offered little warmth against the cold that seemed to seep into his bones. He stared into the flames, his mind drifting back to a time when the air smelled of fresh flowers, not pine and ashes. Abigail had loved the garden more than anything. She'd planted wild tulips and prairie roses in the small patch beside the porch. But after she passed, the garden turned wild, then the snow came, and then everything had stopped. Sam had stopped planting, stopped caring about the land beyond his doorstep. The wind howled louder now. Sam poked at the fire, his mind still lingering on memories he could no longer hold. His cup of coffee sat untouched beside him, cold, but he drank it out of habit. He'd been alone for 2 winters, the ache in his chest a constant companion. He wasn't sure when it had become part of him. That was when he heard it. 3 knocks, slow and deliberate. Sam's hand froze on the coffee cup. The sound came again, louder this time, the 4th knock weaker than the rest. His heart skipped a beat. Nobody came out this way in storms like this. No one traveled the road buried deep under snow. Sam rose stiffly from his chair, his joints creaking in protest, and moved toward the door. The storm greeted him like a slap when he opened it. Cold wind rushed in, biting at his skin. Through the swirling white, Sam saw her, standing at the threshold, a woman who seemed to sway on her feet. Her coat was too big, frozen at the edges, and her face was pale with cold and hunger. Her hair was tangled, damp from the snow. Behind her, 3 small children huddled together, wrapped in a thin quilt that barely covered them. Their eyes were wide, filled with fear. Sam's breath caught in his throat. He didn't speak. He stepped aside, wordlessly inviting them in. The woman didn't say anything either. She moved past him, guiding the children into the cabin with a soft whisper of words. Sam shut the door behind them, bolting it tightly against the storm. The warmth from the fire hit them like a wave. The woman and children stood near it, dripping snow onto the floor. The smallest child held a rag doll tightly against her chest, her eyes never leaving the fire. Sam added another log to the flames. The crackle and hiss filled the room, but no one spoke. After a long moment, the woman's voice broke the silence. "No horse," she said, her voice steady but tired. "We walked 3 days. Wagon wheel broke east of Bitter Ridge. I couldn't carry them all at once." Quote. Sam nodded slowly, absorbing the weight of her words. "You've been walking that long?" he asked, his voice softer than he'd intended. She nodded. "Rachel," she said, "these are mine, Finn, Theo, and Sadie." Sam glanced at the children. The boys nodded shyly, their eyes wide, taking in the warmth around them. Sadie, the smallest, didn't move. She clutched her doll tighter, as though it were the only thing keeping her grounded. "You lost?" Sam asked, his voice low. "No," Rachel answered, her tone quiet but firm, left. That one word hung in the air, more than any story could explain. Sam didn't push further. He didn't need to. He pointed to the chairs by the fire. "Sit," he said. "I'll get something warm." He returned quickly, carrying a bowl of thin broth, too weak to be called a meal, but hot enough to offer comfort. The children ate it quickly, quietly, their hunger showing in every movement. Rachel didn't touch her own bowl. She simply watched them, her eyes soft but watchful. "You should eat," Sam said after a long pause. Rachel shook her head. "I will," she replied, but her gaze never left the children. When they finished, they curled up by the hearth, each of them finding a spot on the rug. Within moments, they were asleep, their small bodies pressed close for warmth. Sam laid an extra quilt over them without a word. He turned to find Rachel watching him, her eyes still guarded, though softer now. "You live alone?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "2 winters now," Sam answered, shrugging as though it didn't matter. Rachel didn't speak for a long while, but when she did, her voice was low. "I tried to go west, had family waiting, or so I thought. My husband turned back when food ran low, said, I made my choice coming out here." Quote. Sam looked at her then, his gaze steady but soft. "He left you in winter, with children." Rachel nodded, her shoulders sinking slightly. Sam didn't speak, just poured fresh coffee into her cup and slid it across the table. She took it, wrapping her fingers around the warm ceramic, letting the heat seep into her frozen hands. "You can stay," Sam said quietly, "till the road clears." Rachel didn't answer immediately. She studied the fire for a long moment, her face unreadable. "Thank you," she finally said, her voice thick with gratitude, but guarded all the same. "No need." The storm raged outside, but inside, something different was starting to stir. Sam sat back in his chair, the weight of solitude slowly lifting, replaced by the quiet hum of life that had been absent for far too long. The next morning, the storm had passed, but its aftermath lingered, covering the world in a blanket of fresh snow. The air felt cleaner now, crisp with the promise of change. Inside the cabin, the fire crackled, warm and steady, and Sam stood by it, stirring oats for breakfast. The smell of hot grain filled the air, a comfort he hadn't realized he missed. Rachel woke first. She rose quietly, checking on her children one by one. Finn and Theo lay in a tangle of limbs, their small faces flushed with warmth. Sadie slept with her doll clutched tightly in her arms. Relief softened Rachel's features as she touched their cheeks, feeling the warmth beneath their skin. She hadn't expected to find them safe after the long walk, let alone warm and fed. Sam glanced over at her, offering a quiet nod as she moved around the room, checking the children. "You slept," he said, a small acknowledgement of the peace that had settled over the cabin since they arrived. Rachel looked at him, her smile faint but genuine. "I tried." The children woke slowly. Finn rubbed his eyes, blinking against the light of the morning. Theo sat up, yawning, while Sadie curled into her mother's side. They all washed at the basin, each moving with quiet purpose. Sam watched them, noting how they didn't ask questions, how they just went about their tasks with the kind of care that spoke of a deep, unspoken understanding. As the day passed, Rachel moved through the cabin, sweeping the floor, mending the edges of an old quilt. She didn't ask if she could help. She just did. Sam noticed, but he didn't comment. He was still processing the strange, steady presence she had brought into his home. By midday, the children were playing quietly near the hearth. Finn had found a wooden horse Sam had carved long ago, something he hadn't touched since Abigail's passing. The boy ran his fingers over the smooth edges, looking up at Sam with wide, admiring eyes. "You make this?" Finn asked, his voice full of awe. Sam nodded. "I did." "It's good," Finn said, smiling. "You can keep it." That smile stayed with Sam longer than it should have, and he felt something shift in his chest. It wasn't hope. He wasn't ready for hope yet, but it was the feeling of something being different. The cabin didn't feel as cold anymore. It didn't feel as empty. That evening, as Sam carved a small piece of wood by the fire, Rachel sat nearby, watching the flames dance. The silence between them wasn't heavy anymore. It had changed, somehow. For the first time since Abigail's death, the cabin didn't feel like a prison. It felt like it might belong to more than one person. Sam worked slowly, the wood in his hands beginning to take shape. He carved with care, his movements slow and deliberate, not rushed. The piece of wood was becoming something more than a simple object. It was becoming a sign of something new. Rachel watched him, her eyes softened by the quiet of the moment. She didn't speak, but she didn't need to. They shared the space in a way that felt like it could last. "Planning to go when the road clears?" Sam asked suddenly, his voice cutting through the quiet. Rachel didn't look up. Her hands kept moving as she mended a tear in one of her children's coats. "I don't know," she said softly, her words slow and thoughtful. "There's nowhere left that expects us." Sam's gaze lingered on her for a moment. He didn't press the question, but he did speak again. "There's work in town? Mrs. Webb could use help come spring." Rachel looked up, surprised by the offer. "You're offering me work?" she asked, her voice carrying a hint of disbelief, not because the offer was out of place, but because it was simple. So simple, like she belonged somewhere again. Sam nodded. "It's just work, but it's something." Rachel studied him for a long moment, as if trying to read something in his eyes. Then she nodded slowly. "Thank you," she said quietly, her voice breaking the silence that had settled around them. That night, as the fire burned low, Rachel moved closer to her children, who had long since fallen asleep. Her hands shook as she tucked them in beneath a quilt Sam had given them. She glanced up at him, her voice barely audible. "You're kind." Sam didn't answer right away. He only watched her for a moment, taking in the sight of her as she moved in the quiet of the cabin. He was used to silence, but this felt different. It was the kind of silence that meant something was growing, something that had been dormant for far too long. Outside, the night was still. The wind had calmed, and the moon hung low over the snow-covered land. Inside the cabin, the warmth from the fire mixed with the scent of pine and earth. Life had found its way into the small, quiet space, and for the first time in a long while, Sam didn't feel so alone. The days that followed fell into a rhythm. It wasn't a planned rhythm, but one that came naturally, built not from expectations, but from need. Sam rose early, as he always did, but now he wasn't the only one stirring. Rachel was awake too, moving softly through the cabin, careful not to wake the children. Sam noticed how she moved now, like she belonged there, like she had always belonged there. The snow began to soften, melting slowly at the edges of the cabin. It wasn't the warm, sudden change of spring, but the patient, steady thawing that came with the passing of time. The land, too, was slowly waking, though not with joy, but with quiet patience, and the children, Finn and Theo, began to grow bolder. They asked questions about the tools Sam used, about the trees and the firewood. They followed him everywhere, soaking in the knowledge he was willing to offer. Sadie stayed close to her mother, humming softly to her doll, never far from Rachel's side. It was in these moments, in the small, quiet actions, that Sam began to feel something shift inside him. He wasn't ready to call it hope. Not yet. But it was something. A soft, steady kind of change that didn't happen all at once. Just enough for him to notice that perhaps, maybe, winter didn't take everything forever. The days passed, each one a little quieter than the last. The storm had long since gone, but its imprint on the land remained. The snow had softened, melting at the edges of the cabin like the frozen earth was stretching, waking from its long sleep. The air still held the chill of winter, but there was a new warmth in the cabin now, a subtle shift that Sam couldn't ignore. He carved wood, not because he had to, but because it had become something to hold on to. His hands, once stiff with grief, now moved with purpose. The small birds, deer, and foxes he shaped seemed to carry the weight of more than just wood. They were his attempts at holding on to something, a tether to a future that felt a little more possible. Finn was always nearby, watching Sam with eager eyes. He tried to mimic every movement, his small hands clumsy but determined as he worked with a scrap of wood and a dull knife. Sam didn't offer much direction, just the occasional word of encouragement. The boy was learning, and that was enough. Sadie, too, watched from the corner, her doll always in hand. It had become a part of her, just as the cabin had slowly become a part of them all. Rachel often sat by the fire, sewing, mending the clothes that had worn thin from the journey. She never asked for permission. She simply moved through the cabin, her quiet presence, a steady rhythm that Sam found he had come to rely on. One evening, after the sun had long set, the sound of hooves cut through the stillness. Sam was by the hearth, carving a new piece of wood, when he heard the faint thud of a horse's hooves against snow. He paused, listening carefully. The rhythm was sharp, too fast, and too clean for the land around them. The door creaked open before Sam could stand, and Rachel froze at the sound. A man stepped inside, his figure shadowed by the storm's lingering chill. He dismounted quickly, his boots crunching the snow beneath them. "Rachel," the man called, his voice tight and thin. "Found you." Sam didn't move, his eyes narrowing at the man's familiar, sharp movements. He didn't recognize him, but Rachel's reaction said it all. She tensed, her body stiffening as she took a step back, her hands instinctively moving toward the children. "Who are you?" Sam's voice was low, steady, but his eyes never left the man. "Randall Byrne," the man said, his lips curling into a thin smile. "Her husband." Sam felt the tension in the room grow thick, like the air had frozen in place. Rachel's jaw tightened, her eyes flashing with something Sam couldn't quite place. "You left us," she said, quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "In winter." Randall Byrne chuckled, a cold, hollow sound. "Mistakes happen," he said, brushing past Sam as if he weren't even there. "But those are my children." Sam stepped forward, his voice sharp. "You're not welcome here." The man laughed again, a hollow sound that echoed through the cabin. "Law might say otherwise," he said, his eyes flicking toward the children as though they were nothing more than possessions. Rachel stepped back, her eyes flickering between the man and Sam, before she turned toward the children. She didn't speak again, just watched them, her gaze focused and intense. Sam remained where he was, his body tense with the weight of the moment. Randall Byrne turned toward the door, his smile lingering in the cold air. "I'll be back," he said, his voice low, "with papers." The door slammed behind him, leaving the room heavy with silence. Sam stood motionless for a long moment, his heart beating a little faster than it should have been. The cabin, once warm and filled with life, now felt cold again, like the wind had slipped in through the cracks. Rachel didn't move, her face still, as she watched the door. Finally she spoke, her voice barely a whisper. "He'll come back," she said, her hands still trembling, "with papers." Sam nodded, but didn't speak. He could feel the weight of her words settle between them, and he knew that things weren't as simple as they'd seemed before. The world outside hadn't forgotten about Rachel, and neither had the man who had left her to die in the cold. The storm had passed, but something new was brewing. Sam could feel it deep in his bones, the calm before the storm. That night, the fire burned low, and the silence in the cabin felt different. It wasn't the peaceful quiet they had grown accustomed to. It was heavy, filled with something they couldn't control. Sam carved in the flickering light, his movements slower than usual. Rachel sat nearby, her face unreadable, her thoughts clearly elsewhere. Outside, the wind had picked up again, the howling winds that always seemed to carry the weight of the world with them. The next morning came too soon, bringing with it a sense of unease. Sam went about his usual tasks, feeding the animals, tending to the fire, checking the barn, but his mind was elsewhere. Rachel didn't say much as she went about her work, but Sam noticed how she moved with a quiet determination. She was more than just a guest in his home now. She had become a part of it, in a way he wasn't ready to acknowledge, but that he couldn't deny. By afternoon, the first rider came. This time, Sam didn't need to hear the hooves to know who it was. The familiar figure of Randall Byrne appeared at the edge of the land, his coat sharp and too clean for the land he crossed. Sam felt a shift in the air, a warning in his gut that told him the battle wasn't over. "Rachel," Randall called again, his voice cutting through the air. "I'm not done with you." Rachel stood by the window, her hand on the glass as if she could push the man away just by staring at him. Her breath came in short, shallow bursts, but she didn't move. She couldn't. Sam stepped forward, his jaw tight. He wasn't going to let Randall take anything more from them. The man stepped closer, holding a piece of paper in his hand. The sheriff followed him, walking slowly behind, his face unreadable. "By order of the circuit court," Randall said, his smile stretching as he handed the paper to Rachel, "custody of the children is granted to me pending further review." Rachel's face went pale, and for a moment Sam thought she might collapse. But instead, she stood tall, her eyes steady. "They're my children," she said, her voice firm. "You left us to die. I won't give them up." The sheriff hesitated, his eyes flicking between the paper and the two of them. The tension in the air was thick, and for a moment, Sam thought everything might fall apart. But the sheriff nodded slowly. "I'll give you 3 days," he said, his voice low. "Then we'll take it to court." Randall sneered and turned to leave, but the threat lingered in the air. Rachel looked at Sam, her face soft but her eyes filled with a quiet, desperate hope. "We'll stand," Sam said quietly. "I won't let them take you from us." 3 days passed, each one heavier than the last. The silence in the cabin had deepened, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. Sam went about his work as usual, but his thoughts were never far from Rachel, the children, and the looming threat of Randall Byrne. The snow had begun to melt in places, but the warmth that had come with it still hadn't reached his heart. Rachel kept to herself, moving through the cabin with quiet grace. She didn't ask for much, but Sam noticed the way she watched the children, her eyes always lingering on them with a tenderness that spoke louder than any words. They were hers, in a way that no law could take away. Sam saw it in the way she held them close, in the way her voice softened when she spoke to them. The children had changed, too. Finn had become more confident, his curiosity growing with each passing day. He spent hours with Sam, following him around the barn, asking about tools, animals, and the land itself. He was a bright boy, eager to learn, and Sam found himself teaching him without thinking. Theo, quiet as ever, would sit by the window, drawing with the charcoal scraps Rachel saved, his mind lost in the simplicity of his creations. And Sadie, sweet Sadie, continued to cling to her rag doll, humming to it softly, as though the world beyond the cabin was too much to understand. But it was Rachel who had changed the most. Sam noticed the way she carried herself now, her shoulders not quite as tense, her movements more fluid. The woman who had come to his doorstep, broken and cold, had become something more, something steady, and in that steadiness, Sam began to see a future. It wasn't a future he had imagined. He had never planned for anyone else to be here, but it was a future nonetheless, and it was one he was beginning to crave. On the 3rd day, the town began to stir. Word of Randall's claim had spread quickly, and soon everyone knew. Mrs. Webb had stopped by that morning with a tray of bread and butter, her way of offering support without speaking a word. Doc Hadley had come too, just to check on the children. Neighbors who had seen Rachel work, seen Sam care for the family, began to whisper quietly among themselves. The quiet whispers were a comfort, but Sam knew that wouldn't be enough. They would need more. The town might support Rachel, but the law wasn't swayed by kind words. It wasn't until the afternoon that the true weight of the situation became clear. The town had gathered, slowly, quietly. People came to stand, not in protest, but in support. Sam didn't know who started it, but by the time the court date arrived, the room would be full. The room wasn't just for Rachel's defense. It was for something deeper. It was a stand, a statement that they weren't just witnesses to Rachel's life. They were a part of it. The morning of the court case arrived cold and gray. The air outside felt thick with anticipation, but inside the cabin, Rachel moved with a quiet calm. Sam had noticed the way her eyes had softened, but there was something steely in her gaze now. She wasn't just fighting for her children anymore. She was fighting for something that had been taken from her a long time ago, her place in this world. Finn was by her side, as he always was, his hand wrapped tightly around her fingers. The boy was quieter than usual, his face more serious, as though he knew the weight of the day. Theo sat by the fire, watching Sam work. Sadie had fallen asleep, her doll clutched tightly in her arms. Sam glanced at them, then back at Rachel. She was already gathering her things, preparing for the battle ahead. "You're ready?" Sam asked, his voice quiet but steady. Rachel nodded. "I'm ready." The walk to town was slow, the snow underfoot still thick in places. Sam and Rachel walked together, Finn at her side. The quiet of the morning was punctuated only by the sound of their footsteps in the snow. Sam could feel the weight of what was coming. He didn't speak much, but his thoughts were racing. all focused on the courtroom and what it would mean for Rachel and the children. When they reached the courthouse, the building was small, but the people gathered around it made it feel like something far bigger. Neighbors, friends, the townspeople who had watched Rachel struggle, watched her stand tall despite everything. They were there for her. They had come to show their support, not with loud protests or demands, but with their quiet presence. The room was full of faces, Sam knew, and for the first time since Rachel had arrived, he felt something stir inside him. It wasn't just support, it was community. And it was something he hadn't realized he'd been missing all these years. Inside the courtroom, the sheriff was already there, sitting with Randall, who stood with his arms crossed, looking as cold and indifferent as ever. The judge sat at the front, his face serious, his eyes scanning the room. He was a man of few words, but Sam knew that his decision would carry more weight than any of them could bear. Rachel stood at the table, her hands folded together. Her shoulders were straight, her expression unreadable. Sam stood beside her, his presence a quiet assurance. Finn sat at her side, his small hands in his lap, looking up at her for strength. The room fell silent as the judge cleared his throat and began the proceedings. Sam didn't speak much during the trial, but when it was his turn, he stood and told the truth. He spoke plainly, simply. He didn't need to embellish what he had seen. He had seen Rachel care for the children, seen them grow and thrive under her care. He had seen the change that had come, not just in her, but in all of them. When it was Rachel's turn to speak, she stood tall, her voice unwavering. She didn't try to explain her choices or her past. She didn't need to. She spoke about her children, about what they meant to her, and about what she would do to protect them. She spoke about Sam, too, about how he had never asked for anything in return, how he had opened his home to them without hesitation. And when the ruling came, it was not loud or triumphant, but soft and firm. The judge had listened, and he had seen the truth. The children were Rachel's. Permanently. The room exhaled as one, the quiet relief palpable. Rachel stood frozen for a moment, and then she turned to Sam. Her eyes filled with something that wasn't fear anymore, but gratitude and something else. A quiet kind of love that Sam hadn't expected. She held out the small wooden ring Sam had carved days before, the one he had made with no promise, but with faith in something lasting. "I don't see rescue when I look at you," she said, her voice steady. "I see home." Sam took the ring from her, his hand steady. He didn't speak. He simply pulled her close, and she let him. Outside, the sun broke through the clouds, warming the earth beneath them. The last of the snow melted away, and the land began to breathe again. Inside the cabin, Sam carved another piece of wood, this time a small cradle for the children, a symbol of the new life they were beginning to build. The days following the trial passed in a quiet, steady rhythm. The cabin felt fuller now, not just in body, but in spirit. Rachel and Sam's lives had woven together in a way neither of them had expected. They moved through each day with purpose, the weight of the world outside still pressing on them, but inside the cabin, something had changed. It wasn't just the children or the work they did. It was the way they all shared the space, as if the cabin, once only Sam's, now belonged to all of them. Finn had taken to shadowing Sam more than ever, his small hands mimicking Sam's movements as they worked together. Sam didn't have to teach him everything. The boy just absorbed it. Every lesson came with the kind of patience that Sam had learned the hard way, and every question Finn asked was answered with a simple truth, spoken slowly, as if the world itself was unraveling in front of them. Theo, quiet and reserved, had begun to open up more. He spent hours sitting by the window, drawing what he saw, sketching the land, the trees, the animals that passed through their little patch of the world. Sam often caught him watching, his eyes soft, his mind drifting. It was the kind of focus Sam had always admired, a quiet strength that didn't demand attention but commanded respect. And Sadie, small and tender, had started to hum less and speak more. Her doll never left her side, but the way she moved through the cabin, the way she played with the boys, was different now. She was growing, finding her own place in the world, just like the others. Rachel had noticed it too. They all had. The mornings were slow, but they had a rhythm. Rachel moved about the cabin, checking the fire, starting breakfast, mending whatever needed mending. Sam noticed how easily she took care of everything, from the children to the chores. There was no need to ask her to do it. She did it because she knew it needed to be done. Sam had never known a woman like her, one who didn't need to be told what to do but did it anyway, quietly, without complaint. They were a family now, not one Sam had planned for, but one he had slowly come to accept. Without fanfare, without grand gestures. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't even easy. But it was real. By the end of the week, the snow had melted almost completely, leaving only traces of white in the shaded corners of the land. Spring was creeping in like the soft pull of the tide, inch by inch. The cabin had begun to smell like earth, like life, like things that had been buried for too long, now beginning to awaken. One afternoon, as Sam returned from the barn, he saw Rachel standing by the window, her hands resting on the frame. She had that look on her face again, the one she got when she was thinking, when she was weighing something heavy. The children were outside, playing near the creek that had thawed just enough to send ripples across the surface. They were laughing, their voices light in the cool air, but Rachel wasn't looking at them. She was looking out at something else, something beyond the cabin. Sam walked up behind her, his footsteps soft on the floorboards. He didn't ask what was on her mind, but he could feel it in the way she held herself. She wasn't ready to leave. Not yet, but he could sense the tension in her. The restlessness that had been there, just under the surface, ever since Randall had left that day with the sheriff. Thinking about the road? Sam asked quietly, his voice steady. Rachel nodded slowly but didn't turn to him. "I think about it every day," she said, her voice soft but firm. "The road west, what it would mean for us." Sam didn't respond immediately. He knew the question she was asking, even if she hadn't said it outright. Would she stay? Would she leave? The road to the west had always been there for her, a promise of something better. A life beyond the dust and the small struggles of the land she had left behind. But Sam wasn't sure what he would do if she left. He couldn't imagine it. And yet, he knew she needed to decide. He knew she had to find her own way, just like he had to find his. "I don't want to hold you here, Rachel," Sam said, his voice low, almost a whisper. "I know you came here because you had nowhere else to go, but I also know you've got a life ahead of you. A future. I won't be the one to stop you from finding it." Rachel turned to face him then, her eyes soft, but her expression unreadable. She stepped away from the window, moving toward him slowly, her gaze never leaving his. "You don't understand," she said, her voice breaking slightly. "I'm not sure I want to go west anymore. I'm not sure I ever did." She paused, her eyes searching his. I think what I've been looking for has been right here all along." Sam didn't say anything at first. He didn't need to. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable. It was full of understanding, full of the weight of what they both knew. They had both been running in their own ways, but they didn't have to anymore. "I don't want to leave," Rachel whispered, her voice barely audible. Sam nodded, his heart steadying as he looked into her eyes. The decision had already been made. It wasn't a grand gesture. It wasn't a promise. It was just a quiet truth that had found its way into their lives, slowly, without either of them realizing it. "Then don't," Sam said simply. Outside, the wind had calmed, and the sun shone down on the land, the last of the snow melting into the earth. The world was waking up again, and for the first time in a long time, Sam felt like he could breathe. Rachel took a step closer, and Sam didn't move away. She reached out, her hand trembling slightly as it found his. And when she looked up at him, there was something in her eyes, something he hadn't seen before, something he hadn't realized he was waiting for. They didn't need words, not yet. But when they finally kissed, the world outside seemed to pause, holding its breath, waiting for them to catch up. Spring arrived slowly, like a secret unfolding beneath the earth. The days grew longer, and the sun grew stronger. The land began to thaw, the creeks running fuller, the earth softening and stretching toward the light. Inside the cabin, there was a quiet hum of life, a rhythm that hadn't been there before. Sam woke to the sound of birds, the smell of bread baking, and the laughter of children running through the yard. It was a life he hadn't expected to have, but one that had become his. The children had adjusted to their new life. Finn had begun helping Sam with the tools, carrying firewood without being asked, his hands learning the weight of labor and care. Theo spent his days by the window, still drawing, still lost in his quiet world. Sadie was quieter now, too, her doll always in hand, but there was a gentleness in her that spoke of something more. She wasn't just the small child she had been when they first arrived. She was growing, finding her own place in this world. Rachel had changed too. Sam could see it in the way she moved, now, no longer weighed down by the heavy silence that had followed her when she first arrived. She worked alongside him with ease, not because she had to, but because it felt natural. There were no more guarded silences between them, no more walls. She was part of this life now, just as much as he was. One afternoon, as Sam returned from the barn, he saw Rachel standing by the porch, watching the horizon. There was something different about her today. The way the sunlight caught her hair, the way her face was soft but purposeful. He walked up beside her, his boots crunching softly on the gravel. She didn't look at him right away, but when she did, her eyes were steady, filled with something that had been there all along. "I've been thinking," she said, her voice steady. "I think it's time for us to settle here, for good." Sam's heart tightened in his chest. He didn't need to ask her what she meant. He knew. He had known since that first moment they had stood in the doorway together. A lifetime ago. The world outside might still be uncertain, but this, the life they had built here, was real. And it was enough. "We'll stay," Sam said, his voice simple, steady. There was no need for more. The decision was made. They had found a home, not in the land, but in each other. Later that evening, as the sun dipped low behind the mountains, Sam and Rachel sat by the fire, the children already asleep in their beds. The night was quiet, the kind of quiet that felt full, not empty. The fire crackled softly, sending small pops into the silence. Rachel leaned back in her chair, her hand resting lightly on the arm, her eyes half closed, as if she was savoring the moment. "It feels good, doesn't it?" she asked quietly, her voice almost a whisper. Sam nodded, the warmth of the fire mixing with the warmth that had spread through his chest. "It does," he said simply. They didn't speak much after that. The quiet was enough. They didn't need to say anything else. It was in the way their hands found each other in the dark, in the way Sam rested his arm on the back of Rachel's chair, in the way they both knew, deep down, that this was the life they had chosen, not out of necessity, but out of desire. The days turned into weeks, and soon the first blooms of summer began to appear. The land that had been so still, so cold, now seemed to breathe with new life. The cabin felt full, not just with people, but with the possibility of something lasting. The children had grown, their laughter no longer tinged with fear, but with joy. They were home. But not everything in the world had changed. Sam knew that. There were still struggles ahead, still moments when the weight of the past would creep up on them. But they had found something that the world could not take away. They had found each other, and they had found a home in the midst of the chaos. One afternoon, as the sun began to set, Sam stood outside, his gaze fixed on the land in front of him. The air was warm, the sky painted with the colors of dusk. He took a deep breath, letting the scent of earth and pine fill his lungs. The world was still. For the first time in years, he didn't feel like he was waiting for something to change. He didn't feel like he was waiting for the next storm to come. Rachel stood beside him, her hand in his. She didn't say anything, but he didn't need her to. He could feel it in the way she held his hand, the way she stood next to him, not as a stranger, but as someone who had found a place beside him in the world. Sam smiled quietly, a small, simple smile, The kind that came without words. Home, he whispered. And it was. It had always been. They just hadn't known it yet. Outside, the last of the snow melted away, the earth beginning to warm and stretch into the long summer days ahead. Inside, the cabin was alive with the sound of children's laughter and the crackling of the fire. Sam carved another piece of wood that evening, his movements slow and steady, each stroke a small promise of something lasting. Rachel sat beside him, her eyes on the fire, her face softened by the light. And for the first time in years, Sam didn't feel alone. If you felt this tale in your heart, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Archives of the Wild West, where every story rides through the dust, the danger, and the kind of love that never dies. See you in the next tale, partner.